Justin Baldoni may have been credited as the director of It Ends With Us, but according to insiders, the final cut was far from the film he thought he was making. Tensions between him and Blake Lively were already obvious when the two refused to take joint photos at the premiere, a move that all but confirmed the growing feud. And now the legal fallout surrounding Blake's company Vanzan is pulling back the curtain on just how deep this conflict really goes. In court filings, Blake's attorneys painted Vanzan as a legitimate corporate entity. But critics argue it looks more like a shell company designed to shield Blake, Ryan Reynolds, and their team from accountability. The most explosive allegations come from Miss Abel, who claims her phone was seized without consent by JonesWorks, her former agency. According to her counterclaims, Stephanie Jones not only accessed her private text messages, but later handed them over to Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and PR powerhouse Leslie Sloan. Abel alleges that Blake used Vanzan to disguise this operation as legal process. On September 27, 2024, Vanzan filed a lawsuit in New York State Supreme Court against unnamed Doe defendants. Within days, Vanzan issued subpoenas demanding documents about It Ends With Us, Blake and Ryan, and even sexual harassment allegations tied to the production. Yet none of those issues were mentioned in the original complaint. Despite the mismatch, Jones quickly handed over Abel's stolen communications to Vanzan. By December 2024, the lawsuit was quietly discontinued. Conveniently, the same month those private communications reappeared in Blake's legal pleadings. Wayfair's attorney, Kevin Fritz, pushed hard for clarity, asking the judge to compel testimony that would confirm whether there was collusion between Jones and Vanzan. His claim? That Jones willingly bypassed objections and handed over communications as part of a coordinated effort. Fritz argued that Ryan and Blake should have been forced to testify, not just attorneys hiding behind the corporate mask of Vanzan. He wanted the court to examine whether communications prior to September 27, 2024, could reveal deliberate coordination and potential abuse of subpoena power. But here's the twist. The judge denied Fritz's motion, not because the claims were irrelevant, but because Wayfair's team failed to follow civil procedure. They hadn't properly met and conferred before filing, a procedural requirement in litigation. In other words, the denial wasn't about substance, it was about process. Still, the documents filed paint a troubling picture. Abel insists Blake and Ryan were directly involved, yet Vanzan insists any deposition can be handled by attorneys, not the stars themselves. To outside observers, this looks less like transparency and more like a carefully orchestrated dodge. Even in their responses, Vanzan's team accused Fritz of manufacturing disputes for media attention, while simultaneously posturing in ways that many critics call gaslighting. At its core, the dispute raises serious questions. Was Vanzan used as a front to launder stolen data into legal proceedings? Were Blake and Ryan directly behind the maneuvers, despite hiding behind lawyers and shell company paperwork? And most importantly, was this entire legal strategy designed not just to control the narrative, but to permanently damage Justin Baldoni's credibility and creative control? What's clear is that the feud between Blake and Justin is no longer just about artistic differences. The courtroom drama, the secrecy around Vanzan, and the allegations of stolen communications paint a much darker story. One of manipulation, power plays, and reputations at stake. The legal conflict surrounding Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, their alleged shell company Vanzan, and the ongoing disputes with Wayfair and Stephanie Jones has taken on a complicated and often confusing shape. The entire matter feels like a strange mixture of Hollywood drama, corporate maneuvering, and courtroom strategy, all wrapped into one unfolding story. At the center of it is a fight over depositions, subpoenas, and whether data was improperly obtained and disguised under the name of a lawsuit that, according to many observers, had little to do with the claims it actually raised. To understand where things stand now, it is necessary to look at the sequence of filings, the strategies deployed by both sides, and how the judge ultimately dismissed a motion on what appeared to be little more than a technicality, even though the core issues remain unresolved. The most striking element of this case is how much of it depends not on dramatic revelations, but on procedural moves. Vanzan, the entity tied to Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, was accused of bringing a lawsuit in New York State court that was not really about what it claimed. On paper, the case was against unnamed defendants, the so-called DOE parties, for breaches of unspecified oral or written promises. But almost immediately, subpoenas were issued to JonesWorks, the company tied to Stephanie Jones, demanding documents connected to the film It Ends With Us. The problem? The lawsuit itself said nothing about that film, nothing about director Justin Baldoni, nothing about alleged sexual harassment or retaliation on set, and nothing about any workplace disputes. Yet somehow the subpoena was aimed directly at material connected to those very topics. For Wayfair's attorney Kevin Fritz, this was a red flag. To him, it looked like a classic example of a sham filing, designed not to pursue the claims stated in the complaint, but instead to create a legal pretext for gathering sensitive data that might otherwise be inaccessible. This ties directly into the allegations from Miss Abel, who claims that her phone was seized by Jones Works shortly before she left the company, and that her private messages were then shared with Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and publicist Leslie Sloan. Abel insists that Lively conspired with Jones to use this material for her own purposes, and that the Vanzan lawsuit was nothing more than a mechanism to launder this stolen data under the guise of discovery. The timeline is particularly damning, according to critics. Stephanie Jones allegedly shared communications with Lively and Reynolds before the lawsuit was even filed, and within days of the suit being launched, Jones Works produced Abel's communications in response to Vanzan's subpoena. The lawsuit was later discontinued in December 2024, but by then the damage was done. The private material had been integrated into pleadings and used in ways that Abel says were deeply harmful. What happened next is where the current dispute takes shape. Wayfair and Kevin Fritz sought to compel testimony from Vanzan representatives about these events. They wanted to question someone with knowledge of how Vanzan was set up, what its purpose was, and whether there was any pre-existing relationship between Vanzan and Jones Works that explained why documents were turned over without objection. After all, in ordinary circumstances, no competent business would simply hand over sensitive data without challenging the scope of a subpoena that had no obvious connection to the stated claims of a lawsuit. For Fritz, this suggested collusion or at least prior coordination. But instead of answering those questions directly, Vanzan responded with layers of lawyers, objections, and procedural defenses. They argued about the scope of the questions, the timeline, and whether the topics were even relevant. And they were careful to distance Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds personally from the proceedings, ensuring that it was always corporate representatives or attorneys on the line, rather than the celebrities themselves. The dispute over timing is especially telling. The subpoena sought information dating back to January 1st, 2022. Vanzan objected, saying the only relevant time period began in September 2024, when the New York lawsuit was filed. According to them, anything earlier than that had nothing to do with the case. But critics argue this is exactly the problem. The lawsuit itself had little to do with anything, and the real purpose was to create a legal vehicle to obtain and legitimize data that had already been acquired. For that reason, Fritz and Wayfair pushed to expand the timeline, insisting that the relationship between Jones Works and Vanzan had to be examined from an earlier date to uncover whether there was coordination and improper purpose. Vanzan countered that it never refused to testify on topics within the subpoena, and that it would provide a corporate representative, but insisted that the objections were standard, and that any motion to compel was unnecessary. To them, the defendants were manufacturing a dispute simply to generate press and paint Vanzan as a sham entity. When the matter reached the judge, the result was anticlimactic but significant. The motion to compel was denied, not on the merits, but on a procedural technicality. The judge ruled that Wayfair and Fritz had failed to engage in a proper meet and confer before filing the motion, as required by civil procedure. This left the door open for the issue to return later, but for now it meant that Vanzan avoided a direct ruling on the substance of their objections. Still, the judge did grant attorney's fees against Fritz, essentially penalizing him for skipping a required step. Yet even in denial, the motion had an effect. In the course of responding, Vanzan appeared to concede that it would not ultimately block questions about the earlier timeline, undermining its own objection. In this way, Fritz may have gotten what he wanted anyway, though without a clear judicial order backing him up. The back-and-forth communications between the parties reveal just how much of this fight is about controlling the narrative. Vanzan insists that the defendants are mischaracterizing events to create media buzz, accusing them of trying to drag a non-party into litigation for show. They say they were always willing to comply with deposition requests and that the dispute was manufactured. Meanwhile, Fritz portrays Vanzan as stonewalling, hiding behind lawyers, and carefully avoiding direct answers that might expose the real purpose of the original lawsuit. His frustration is clear in filings where he recounts unanswered emails, shifting positions, and vague promises that never seem to materialize into concrete stipulations. To him, it looks like Vanzan is playing for time, hoping that by the time depositions occur, the urgency will have faded or the media cycle will have moved on. There is also the question of who exactly will testify for Vanzan. Thus far, all the names put forward are attorneys, not executives or individuals with first-hand knowledge of how the company was used. This raises concerns that any deposition will be limited in scope, full of objections, and lacking in substantive answers. Without Lively or Reynolds in the hot seat, the most crucial questions may remain unanswered. Were they aware of the alleged seizure of Abel's phone data? Did they instruct Jones Works to hand over communications? Was the New York lawsuit filed with the genuine intent of pursuing contractual claims, or was it always meant to serve as cover for other purposes? These questions go to the heart of the case, but they are unlikely to be addressed if the deposition is handled by attorneys who can claim lack of personal knowledge. From a legal strategy standpoint, the maneuvering makes sense. By hiding behind procedure and corporate formality, Vanzan can delay substantive scrutiny while keeping its principles insulated. At the same time, the longer the fight drags on, the harder it is for the opposing side to maintain momentum, both legally and in the court of public opinion. But the optics are difficult to ignore. For an entity accused of being nothing more than a shell company, every evasive response, every procedural objection, and every refusal to put real people under oath only strengthens the suspicion that there is something to hide. In summary, the latest ruling may not have resolved much, but it illustrates the complex dynamics at play. Vanzan wants to appear cooperative while still keeping tight control over what information gets disclosed and when. Wayfair and Fritz want to expose what they see as a sham and force Lively and Reynolds into the open. The judge, for now, is insisting that the rules of procedure be followed before he weighs in on the merits. And in the meantime, the public is left with a tangled web of accusations, denials, and technicalities that obscure the central question. Was this lawsuit a legitimate legal action? Or was it simply a tool to legitimize stolen data and protect powerful figures from accountability? Until real testimony occurs, from real people, not just lawyers, that question is unlikely to be answered. But the groundwork has been laid for a contentious deposition, and the battle over narrative will only intensify as more filings come to light. The situation surrounding Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and the now infamous Vanzan lawsuit has become one of the most confusing and controversial legal dramas in recent memory. What started as a seemingly minor issue has ballooned into a complex narrative of subpoenas, shell companies, accusations of misconduct, disputes over evidence, and questions of whether the entire case was even filed properly in the first place. To fully understand the weight of what's happening, it's important to step back and examine the timeline, the players, and the motivations. Because what appears on the surface as a legal disagreement may in reality be something much deeper, something that touches on abuse of process, misuse of legal loopholes, and the possibility that Blake and Ryan themselves are caught in a web of tactics that could backfire dramatically. At the center of all this is the Vanzan lawsuit, which many legal experts have already described as improper. Attorneys familiar with the case have said that if this were truly a legitimate claim, it would have been filed directly against the proper parties, the movie itself, the producers like Justin Baldoni and Jen, and even Wayfair, which was connected to some of the controversy. But that never happened. Instead, a shell company, Vanzan, was used to file the action. That's already a red flag, because shell entities are often a way to shield the real parties from scrutiny. The lawsuit avoided naming those actually involved, which meant that subpoenas could be sent out quietly, without the proper notifications that normally protect individuals and companies from fishing expeditions. In effect, the move allowed data to be obtained and weaponized without transparency. And then, when you look at who was targeted, the case becomes even stranger. Rather than pursuing claims directly against the people who supposedly wronged them, Vanzan honed in on one person, extracted information, and then leveraged that data into a lawsuit. This is where the allegations of abusive process come into play. If the lawsuit was legitimate, why hide behind secrecy? Why avoid naming the actual parties? Why not file openly, transparently, and above board? Instead, there was hiding, obfuscation, and cover-ups, which suggests that the motives here were not about justice, but about manipulation. The problem grows even murkier when you consider the sudden attorney shuffle. Vanzan was originally represented by one firm, Manat, but then, seemingly out of nowhere, they switched to a brand new attorney. If everything was clean and legitimate, why the change? Why all the secrecy? These switches often happen when a case starts to crack under its own weight, when a firm realizes the risks of being attached to something that may be legally questionable. It raises the perception that the lawsuit itself was never solid, and that those behind it have been scrambling to keep it alive. Complicating this further is Blake Lively's role. Multiple reports and accounts describe her as being particularly difficult to deal with throughout the process. Her demands, according to people involved, have been unreasonable and sometimes impossible to meet. Wayfair, for instance, has been placed on the defensive time and time again, forced to respond to requests that range from overreaching subpoenas to motions that lacked credible evidence. In fact, the judge himself has already shut down some of Blake's motions because they were based on nothing more than belief rather than proof. For example, when Blake accused Sourced Intelligence, an investigative firm that had supported Wayfair's attorneys, of being part of a smear campaign, the judge dismissed it outright. The CEO of the company filed a declaration denying the claim, and with no evidence from Blake to back up her accusation, the court ruled against her. This is part of a larger pattern. Blake has repeatedly issued subpoenas that were overbroad, asking for materials she had no right to demand. She has tried to obtain communications that didn't exist, insisting that Wayfair and other parties hand over information that simply wasn't there. And when those demands weren't met, she pushed harder, filing motions that courts viewed as unfounded. All of this suggests a strategy not of seeking justice, but of creating pressure, drowning the other side in legal work, and using the courts as a weapon rather than as a fair venue for truth. Against this backdrop, the issue of evidence becomes critical. The so-called chain of custody, essential in any legitimate legal proceeding, is now under serious question. If evidence was obtained improperly, through shell company subpoenas designed to avoid scrutiny, then the very foundation of Blake's case could collapse. Any materials gathered this way might be thrown out. If that happens, the entire lawsuit could unravel. In legal terms, evidence gathered through abuse of process is tainted, and if the court rules it inadmissible, then Blake and Ryan's strategy will implode. That's why observers say the evidence is fragile. It's like a house of cards. One misstep, and it all falls apart. Meanwhile, the media has become another battleground. Stories are being leaked, spun, and reframed in ways that appear to serve one side or the other. For example, the bizarre incident involving a man arrested near Taylor Swift's house, allegedly a process server attempting to serve her legal papers, was quickly seized on by national tabloids. They painted it as part of this wider legal saga, implying connections to Baldoni or Wayfair. Yet local outlets in Kansas where the arrest happened reported none of that. They simply noted that a man was arrested without tying it to Taylor Swift or the lawsuit. This discrepancy suggests that someone was deliberately pushing a narrative to the national media, trying to smear certain individuals while deflecting attention from the real issue, Vanzan's questionable lawsuit. This tactic of distraction is powerful. By planting stories, the focus shifts away from the fragile evidence and the procedural flaws, and instead paints opponents in a negative light. It creates noise, confusion, and drama, exactly what Blake and Ryan might want if their legal foundation is shaky. But in the end, distraction doesn't change facts. The question remains, was the Vanzan lawsuit legitimate? And if not, what does that mean for everything that has happened since? What's most striking is how all of this seems to fit a pattern of gaslighting and gamesmanship. The constant demands, the unreasonable motions, the secrecy, the attorney swaps, the overbroad subpoenas. It all builds a picture of legal theater designed not to win fairly, but to exhaust, confuse, and manipulate. Wayfair has recognized this, which is why they filed their own motions to force clarity. They are essentially saying, enough is enough. Give us the answers, testify, and stop playing games. And yet, even when Blake was compelled to address the Vanzan issue directly, her response was evasive. Reports indicate that she answered only one question, with a single line, sharing nothing of substance. That alone speaks volumes. If the case were truly solid, if the evidence were truly damning, why withhold? Why not provide transparency? The refusal to engage fully reinforces the suspicion that Blake and Ryan are scrambling to protect something fragile, something that could shatter under scrutiny. The long-term consequences of this could be severe. If courts ultimately rule that the Vanzan lawsuit was improper, that evidence was obtained illegitimately, or that subpoenas were abused, it opens the door to major repercussions. Not only could Blake's case against Wayfair collapse, but there could also be grounds for countersuits. Wayfair and others might claim damages for abuse of process, for reputational harm, and for the sheer financial and legal burden of dealing with what they see as frivolous or manipulative actions. The fallout could be enormous. What's clear now is that this drama is far from over. Blake and Ryan may be celebrities used to controlling narratives in Hollywood, but in court, the rules are different. Courts require evidence, proper procedure, transparency, and legitimacy. If you fail to meet those standards, no amount of spin can save you. And that is the danger here. If their legal team has gambled on obfuscation and secrecy, then the gamble may backfire catastrophically. As for Justin Baldoni, Jen, and the others who were not directly named in the Vanzan action, their exclusion is almost as telling as their involvement would have been. It raises the suspicion that this was never about pursuing justice against those truly involved, but about targeting selectively, avoiding transparency, and shielding the bigger picture. And in the process, it may have exposed Blake and Ryan to even more scrutiny than if they had simply filed openly and honestly in the first place. At the heart of this lies a simple truth. Evidence is only as strong as the process that gathers it. If the process is tainted, the evidence collapses. And if the evidence collapses, so does the case. That's why this saga feels so unstable, so precarious. Blake and Ryan may have thought they could control it, but the reality of the legal system is catching up to them. If Wayfair gets the answers they want and proves that the process was abused, the entire scheme may implode, and not quietly.